point, I'll just sort of live with it really, is that, that really what we've done with analyzing social media is that we've tended to focus on behaviors that are broadly progressive or pro-democratic in the broadest sense. But what if the social media-enabled behaviors are not progressive or are not pro-democratic? What if they're actually democratically dysfunctional? And I think there's a paradox here, which is that on the one hand, some of my work on hybridity as a framework has sought to integrate the loose, informal, often cultural and subcultural political logics that we've seen grow in importance over the last decade. But it's only recently become clear that this hybridity has dysfunctional elements, and it's enabled, first of all, for instance, inauthentic social media expression. See, for example, the role of bots in the 2016 campaign in the US, in integration with the TV debates in particular, or the integration of Facebook micro-targeting with television media and Trump's physical rallies in 2018. And also, for instance, social media expression that's designed to cultivate the spread of misinformation, mutual mistrust, incivility, intolerance, and hatred. So I think we're still developing the conceptual and methodological tools to come to terms with this new set of problems. And I think the second problem here is that research on social media and politics has tended to use what I'll call the engagement gaze. So most, though not all, research on social media has assumed that more engagement means more democratic goods for the media system and the polity. And the engagement gaze has really conditioned us to look for and celebrate engagement irrespective, first of all, of its ideological content. Secondly, irrespective of the likely negative systemic consequences for democratic norms of that engagement. And thirdly, how the media forms that not only bear content, but also shape the production and reception of content can lead to democratically dysfunctional outcomes. So that's a problem too. And I think the next problem is that a lot of research on social media is being driven by what I'll call the rationality expectation. So this has led us to expect that citizens exercise reason in the interactions that enable them to arrive at judgments about the conduct of public affairs. And this has led us to assume that citizens are reflective, that they act on the best information available in the media system, and that today the best information is found online in various forms. Now, as Ashley Hedrick, Dave Karpf, and Daniel Kreis argue in a recent review of Whitney Phillips's outstanding book on trolling culture, which is called This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things, much of the scholarship about digital media and politics, and I quote, generally posits that people act rationally and in good faith, care about facts, truth, and authenticity, pursue ends in line with their political and social values and aspirations, and more philosophically are fundamentally good. End of quote. And the problem is that these underlying assumptions are seldom questioned. So Phillips and other recent studies of the rise of trolling and the so-called ambivalent internet are valuable for moving us beyond these complacent assumptions. I think the problems generated by the engagement gaze and the rationality expectation have also been somewhat elided in research that has foregrounded affect or emotion as a key driving force in online politics. And there's an unresolved paradox here. We know that affect and emotion interacts with the affordances of social media and plays a role in opinion formation. And this creates social solidarity and identity, and scholars such as Zizi Papakarisi have pointed this out. And they've argued that this is essential as a precursor to democratic engagement. It all sounds good and healthy. But of course, the social force of affect online is such that the identities it shapes are highly resistant to challenge and subversion. They're difficult to dislodge, even if they're democratically dysfunctional. And of course, there's mounting evidence that they ought to be challenged and subverted. So that's a problem as well. And my final problem is what I'll say is just that the specific affordances of media have played only minor roles in traditional mainstream public opinion research. With some important exceptions, mainstream public opinion research has been mostly about the message, not the medium. And yet, however, mainstream public opinion research has paid attention to democratically dysfunctional aspects of how public opinion is formed. For example, through studying biased elite cues, the limits to genuinely informed public opinion when media exposure is conditioned by partisanship, polarization, selective exposure, motivated reasoning, and so on. So some of the things that Stuart was talking about earlier on. And I think what's urgently missing now, just as Stuart argued that biological response methods are missing, I would also argue that what's specifically missing from this literature is attention to how the affordances of social media interact with the limits to what we know shape citizens' reasoning about public affairs. And of course, we also need to add to the mix that social media affordances aren't always what they appear to be on the surface. They're vulnerable to being exploited, they're often hidden, and also elite actors of various kinds can manipulate affordances in order to influence public opinion. So finally, I would say that it now seems essential to try to address these problems once and for all in some way. Well, I think it would be unwise, first of all, to abandon the engagement gaze and the rationality assumption as both normative ideals and analytical frameworks. They involve valuable principles to inspire research in this so-called post-truth era. Despite the growth of social media, and maybe, just maybe because of it, counter to many of the expectations over the last 20 years, elite access to media of all kinds and elite persuasion are still highly important for the formation of public opinion. So one important task is to identify the conditions under which elite persuasion is effectively challenged and diffused by oppositional engagement, and when it isn't. The next point is that propaganda, misinformation, hate speech, and incivility are radically networked like never before. So we need to adopt what I would call an information as resources perspective. We need to look at the raw materials that are required for individuals and organizations to behave in democratically dysfunctional ways. We need to recognize that these are diverse and multiple. They're about media content and affordances, journalistic cues, cues from political elites, automated and algorithmic cues as well. We need better understandings of how social media interact with and potentially reconfigure the different limits to opinion formation at the individual level. And finally, we should identify the conditions under which these limits most strongly apply, the extent to which those limits are shaped by a blend of cognitive biases, social identities, and social media affordances, and finally, how overall we can minimize the impact of those limits in the interests of promoting democratic norms and behaviors. Thanks very much.